Part 6, building a high-level creative strategy process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you haven't listened to any of those, wherever you are, Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts for the 2%ers or 1%ers that use that instead of Spotify, check us out, see what those episodes are about. But in today's episode, we're going to be focusing on the creative has been approved by the client. Now we need to go into the creative testing phase. This episode, I think, would be very good for creative strategists because it's not as much about creative strategy per se as it is the media buying side and making sure that the media buying is being executed properly so that the creative can bring the results or the data that we need that way. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to talk about. Campaign structuring, timelines for testing, budgets for testing, but I guess campaign structuring might be the starting point there. How are we actually setting up our test? How are we going about doing this? There's so many different ways. People have separate campaigns for creative testing. Some people swear by you need to put your testing creative in your evergreen campaigns and run it at a full budget. I don't know if there is one right answer for this. I have to be very transparent up front and say that, right? I don't know if there's one way to do it. Barry Hott, in a previous episode that we had with him, said a good creative can perform in just about any campaign. If the ad is good enough, it will perform. But we all have preferences. And at BrighterClick, and Charlie, I know you as well, when you worked with us, but also on your independent time, have seen testing campaigns and structures that work best. So let's start there. Where do you generally fall when it comes to campaign structuring for creative testing?
I feel like this is a topic that could cause some tears. Yeah. Because I do feel like media buyers, myself included, right? We're quite technical and we're quite analytical. And the algorithm, as much as if you're a good media buyer, should have like an understanding of how it operates. There's a lot that we don't understand about how the algorithm operates. And Facebook make it that way intentionally so that we can't game the system. So there are a lot of things I think that really good and experienced media buyers probably should actually have opinions on. And this is one of them. And if you're a media buyer and you don't have an opinion on this, I apologize because I've kind of inadvertently called you a bad media buyer there. But I think it's important to have a structure, know why you're using that structure and stick with it. I just think that's super, super important. But I guarantee that there'll be a lot of media buyers that will disagree with what my structure I think that I'm about to share. So what I always think with creative testing, the first thing that I see a lot of disagreement on is if the creative doesn't get spend, it's not going to work. Meta knows what performs and what doesn't perform. So if Meta doesn't spend on your creative, that's a creative fail. I very strongly disagree with that. I have seen it happen in so many ad accounts where, especially post iOS 14.5, like Meta would optimize for on-platform metrics. So, and by optimize, I mean optimize delivery and push spend where on-platform metrics are good. So where click-through rate's good, where hook rate is good, where people are stopping and looking, maybe they click read more. When Meta sees that kind of activity, it's like, oh, this is a good post, this is a good ad. Like users of the platform are liking this, let's put more spend there. But that doesn't equate to money in your bank account. Like that ad might not convert. People might not even click the link. So that's been my own experience as a media buyer. I see Meta quite often optimizing for on-platform metrics. And so if Meta doesn't give any spend to one of my new creatives that I'm testing, I don't automatically assume, right, Meta knows that creative's not going to perform. I'm never going to run that again. I'll put it in its own ad set or switch off the one that's hogging all the delivery. And I will let data run through that creative and let the data tell me whether that creative is going to perform or not. So that I think is a good intro in terms of which campaign structure, because there are a lot of media buyers that will say, do CBO, do campaign budget optimization, which is where budget is optimized at the campaign level. Meta will put spend in the ad sets or creatives that it believes is going to perform well. So there's a lot of people that believe in that as a campaign structure for testing and following the delivery that the algorithm gives. But I just really disagree. I just think you have to do ABO and you have to make sure every creative gets a fair shot and gets a fair amount of spend to make a decision about whether that creative test has succeeded or failed. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, and what you're referring to, just for anyone that wants to research that a little bit more, Facebook calls it the breakdown effect, where they say that they have pacing to show that if you have an ad that spent $500 or $400 and got a $45 CPA, and you have an ad that spent $50 and got a $30 CPA, that it's predicting and it knows that if it spent the $400, it would get a much higher CPA. That's what Facebook says. I do agree with you that I like to put money through the ads to see if they're going to perform or not. I like to actually see the data. I don't want to just assume that it's not going to work because it didn't get spent. There's times where that we've seen where certain formats get more spend in ad sets than others. So it's just not going to happen because of the actual format going into
like
different
CPA
places.
will chew up spend. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So how can you truly know if it's going to perform or not because it didn't get it? So I agree. I like to have a separate testing campaign. I like to put budget towards that. I like to be able to control the variables of spend and see where it's going. I do think one thing that is key to think is don't let a creative testing campaign turn into an excuse to waste client budget, right? It's like, oh, this one campaign burned a ton of spend and got a poor ROA, but it's creative testing, so that's what we expected, right?
Meh.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's our creative testing dumpster there. So I agree. I think that
creative testing dumpster. Yeah. I'm glad you agree, actually, because that could have turned, well, I mean, it might have got a lot of listens if we'd have got into a heated debate on this one. But yeah, I agree. And I think really important point you made there about creative testing as well, which is super massive part of the structure of testing, is being controlled and restricted on the budget that you put through testing, because creative tests are risks. You don't know if it's going to perform. You might have done an iteration of the best performing ad that you're like, this is going to kill it. But again, experienced media buyers will know that creative performance never or very rarely follows what you expect it to do. And you should never be arrogant enough to assume that you know what's going to work, because Meta just throws curveballs at you all the time. Like, you have to test. So irrespective of whether you've got 100% iterations of the top performing campaigns, any budget that you put through any test is a risk. And so if you're putting 50% of your budget through the creative testing campaign and 50%, well, not yours, the client's, 50% of the client's budget through BAU, 50% of that budget is at risk of not performing because it's creative testing. So that, I would say, is also a super important consideration for when you're structuring your ad accounts for testing, is have an amount of spend that you're okay to potentially tank. And I would say a good range is between 10 and 20%. Depends on the risk appetite of the client, depends on whether overall ad account performance is. If the ad account's performing really well and you can afford to risk a bit more budget on testing, but even out around KPI, fantastic, you can go in the higher rate. But don't just, like you said, make that campaign the creative testing dumpster fire and be like, oh, that's why ad account performance was bad. No, you're the media buyer. You're responsible for that. So make a conscious strategic decision how much budget you're going to put through your spending campaign.
And one thing that's important as well, and you also have to kind of get outside of the ad account, which this is going to put us on a tangent for a second, but I'll get us back on course, is where one thing we have noticed generally is, like, if you launch ads on a Friday going into the weekend, they don't perform well, right? So we try to not launch creative tests going into the weekend. But also, did a world event happen that just caused people to stop shopping or reduce shopping for a couple of days? Is like, is there factors outside of your ad account? Let's not just be media buyers that are stuck to campaign strategies and growth hacking and things like that. Like, let's look at the bigger picture and the macro and understand if there is things, a presidential candidate got shot in the ear and maybe shopping for your product type slower down or something, right? Like, just think about those things as well as you're doing creative testing.
Yeah. And that's another nice segue, I think, into testing parameters, is don't just run tests for 2 days or 3 days, because, Temu, how do you say that? Temu?
I say Temu, but I don't know if that's right or not.
Okay. Temu might have just launched a new campaign and increased their spend by literally like $3 million for that week. And so CPMs could have gone through the roof, but you don't have a clue about that. And if there's a massive CPM spike on that one day that you tested that one creative, of course your CPA or your ROAS is going to look different. But that's the problem with only testing it for 3 days. You're taking a decision based on such a small window where there could be fluctuation happening that would stabilize if you left that running for 7 days.
Yeah, and it's important there to think about outside of your ad account. You could look at all your client accounts and see, but also, like, the North Beam newsletter, which I love because they show week over week, like how CPMs and things are trending. It's just seeing the bigger picture to understand if there is it Facebook, or is it the business, or is it the macro? Like, what is causing this that could be driving performance? And you say timelines. Timelines to me can come in two ways. One is chronological, number of days, and the other is just spend. Like, how long or how much spend are we going to give this? And that gives us our timeline. Where are you generally at in terms of how long you let ads run, spend wise, time wise, or is it too dynamic to say?
No, I'd say that I would actually advise having some fixed parameters on this as the media buyer and or creative strategist, because then it takes the emotion out of it. And that, I think, is better for a testing structure, is to just have parameters that you follow. So the parameters that I like to follow is I would let an ad creative spend 2 times the current CPA of the ad account. So the client's goal for CPA might be $50. And so 2 times CPA would be maybe like $100 that I would let it spend. But if the client's target is 50, but actually the account overall, including the current top performers, is getting $70 CPA, then I would let it spend the current CPA at 70 times 2. So I would let it spend 140.
That's very important. Very important to look at realistic expectations versus goals for measuring performance.
Totally. Yeah, 100%. And where possible, I would let it spend absolute minimum 3 days. Absolute minimum, no matter what the spend is. Like, even if that goes over 140, I would probably still let it go for longer than 3 days, or I would look at the balance between the daily budget and how much I'm going to allow it to spend. Because again, you don't want to be like in a position where the ad has spent over 2 times the CPA in one day, and Temu was going wild that day, so CPMs were through the roof, and you're like, nope, this creative's never going to work. But actually, it was a CPM issue, and the click-through rate was great, the conversion rate was great, and on any other normal day, the CPA would have been fantastic.
And let's bring up one other thing that would be, you said the campaign structure would be the controversial one, but I think this next topic might be a little bit more controversial. I'll start by saying this: order of priority, or do you not consider one or the other? When you're analyzing performance of ads and you're making decisions, performance metrics or soft metrics, which one are you looking at first?
Ooh, this is a good one. I would say, okay, I'm what's the word? Contradicting myself now. I would say it sometimes does depend on the client account, right? So if your current CPA is 70 and you can let a creative spend up to 140, or that's the decision, that's the parameter we've set, then fine. But if you're a brand where, I don't know, it's high-end jewelry and your CPA is 500, are you going to let a creative spend $1,000 before you decide whether to pull the plug on it or not? That's pretty irresponsible media buying. So I think that plays a part in it, in terms of like looking at the soft or creative metrics versus the harder, more performance metrics. So at that point, I would be, let's use the $500 CPA one, because that's the more extreme example where my rule that I just said a second ago wouldn't apply, is I would then be looking at impressions. So bit of a 180.
The soft. Because
I want to make sure that it's I'm making decisions on statistically significant data. So if it's, I'm not going to let it spend 2 times the CPA, because that would be $1,000, but I would be looking at the soft metrics. I wouldn't make any decisions based on soft metrics before 3,000 impressions. I would try and, whatever the spend, I mean, totally dependent on the CPM, right? But whatever the spend is to let that creative get to 3,000 impressions, I would then start looking at soft metrics. Like, is there a problem with the click-through rate? Is there a problem with the hook or the hold rate? So I would be looking at the creative metrics, the soft metrics around that point. And then after that, I would then start looking at performance metrics. So if at 3,000 impressions, the click-through rate is absolutely diabolical and there's no conversions, because sometimes click-through rate can be low and conversion rate can be high. If you've been really good at singling out your audience, then that's very common. You'll have a below average click-through rate, but a phenomenal conversion rate, and your overall CPA or ROAS is within KPI. So don't be scared of a low click-through rate as long as the conversion rate is there. And that's why I like to make sure like I get to that 3,000 impressions point, because you need enough data going through to know whether like you can make those calls or not. So I would be looking at, the soft metrics first at the 3,000 impressions mark. And if the soft metrics are rubbish, I would start looking at early funnel metrics. So if we're sending people to the homepage, have we got view contents firing? Are people interested enough to make their way to a product page? If we're sending people straight to a product page, have we got add to carts happening? Are they taking that next step into the funnel? So at that point, I would be then looking at, I definitely would be looking at cost per view content or cost per add to cart for the creative testing versus my BAU or top performing creatives. Don't just look at volume. This is really important. Don't just look at volume, because volume is directly correlated with spend. So don't say, well, this has only got 2 add to carts, but that doesn't really tell you anything. You want to look at the cost per add to cart in a relative sense. And that's why the 3,000 impressions is also important, because you need enough volume of add to carts for the cost per add to cart to be comparable to be able to make a decision. So really important to look at cost per and not volume. So if I'm looking at early funnel metrics, I'd be looking at the cost per view content or the cost per add to cart of my creative test versus the BAU to make a decision whether I should carry on spending and give it a little bit more chance to prove to me that it can perform.
Yeah. And I think, what's the most controversial way I could put this for the clicks? I think all metrics matter, but very few metrics matter by themselves. So CAC or CPA, very important on its own. Like if an ad is getting a good CAC or CPA on its own, not even say ROA, but CAC or CPA on its own, great. Like I don't care about anything else. But if it's getting a good CTR and that's all we're looking at, I don't have confidence in the ad because it may not be performing. There's been times where we've set up ads. Give a quick tangible example. We were working with a resume builder app or a resume builder website, a well-established one, and we were trying to find ways to increase CTR. In the software world, more often than not, or more common than any other industry, the idea of, well, let's just double CTR to cut our CAC in half comes up, which is not the case, but this was the case that we were battling. So we went with that. And we doubled over the CTR by doing meme type ads. But the CAC was horrible because we were giving people the idea that they were clicking on a meme and then we were driving them to build a resume, right? So we're memes about hating resumes and hating work, and then go build your resume. It didn't line up. It didn't work, right?
No conversion rate, right?
Yeah. The
great CTR, awful CVR.
Yeah. So CAC, I think, matters on its own. I think is very important. I can even say conversion rate on website or landing page matters on its own, but very few other metrics matter by themselves. You have to combine them into a group to really comprehend what's happening.
100%. And this comprehension of data is absolutely vital. I don't know how many episodes ago it was now, because we are on a roll today with podcast recordings. But one of the recent episodes that we recorded today, we talked about how like the medium performers and how like if something doesn't meet CAC, but it had, I don't know, a great conversion rate, but a poor click-through rate, like being able to comprehend the data and understand how all of those metrics interlink with one another and the relationship between them is so important, because you're going to miss like really big opportunities or really big learnings if you're only looking at the CAC and not kind of taking anything else away from that. And likewise, if you, like we had a client where it was like the CPC is too high. We can't continue with a CPC of $9, but the cost per finalized event, which was what we were optimizing for, ultimately, that's what we were hired to do, was like lower than anything else that they'd had. But we can't have a $9 CPA. Why not? Your cost per booked appointment is within your KPI. Why do you give a toss about the CPC? Yeah. Because sure, we can increase the click-through rate. We can get the CPC down if we try and be clickbaity, but then you're going to get into an absolutely horrendous cycle where we'll get the click-through rate and the CPC down, but you'll have no conversion rate because you're not setting the right tone. Like it comes back to, I actually quite often see the optimum like metric relationship for performance is a lower click-through rate and a higher conversion rate. And that means that you're really understanding the psychographic needs of your audience. So you're speaking to a really specific problem or a really specific solution that doesn't appeal to everybody, but that's fine, because the people that it does appeal to, your conversion rate is insane. I'm talking like I've seen really great performance ads with like CTR of 0.25, conversion rate of 11% on a cold audience, because you're speaking to a specific group of people that really resonates, and those are your people. Go and make lookalikes out of those audiences. Don't try and get your click-through rate up, because your conversion rate will go down. You're less relevant. The conversion won't be there. And then your overall CAC's going to suffer. So I got really worked up about that. Sorry, guys. But understanding the relationship between the metrics is just so important.
And the idea is there, which if we can improve traffic, we can get more sales, right? But oftentimes the execution does not lead to that, right? Because it's just not, that might work. I'm even trying to empathize and just kind of come to a middle ground with that. Like that might work if you have a really big TAM, like you have a really big market and but if you're a super niche software, if you're a niche e-commerce product, things like that, sometimes low CTRs, low CTR is great. Like all we care about is our CAC. What is our CAC doing? And is it moving down brief over brief with creative that way?
And what I would be focused on, instead of trying to get the CTR up, is scaling that ad. Can I scale that ad vertically? Can I scale it horizontally? How can I iterate on that ad? Can I keep the exact same message but change the visual? Can I keep the exact same visual but change the message slightly? Like, how can I iterate on this? This is lowest performing CAC. I don't care about the CTR. I want to get more of this CAC. How do I get more of this CAC? It's a way better use of your agency's time to figure out how you can scale that than trying to get the CTR up.
Yeah, it's kind of like the C's get degrees. At the end of the day, you got a degree, you get a job. At the end of the day, nobody cares about a big brand, a 9-figure brand CTR in their account. They care about the fact that they reach 9 figures. And how do they do that? By getting purchases and conversions that way.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We have discussed quite a bit on this episode as well, just focusing on creative testing. I know there is 50,000 things that people talk about every day on Twitter that we could have discussed here, but we just brushed over some important topics. This was episode.
Sorry, before you wrap that one up, there was one other really, really important thing about creative testing. It was my own fault for going off on my little rant about metrics. But the other thing I would say is really, really important for your testing campaigns is making sure that you're giving enough spend to allow the creative to optimize. So we know with Meta wants you to try and get 50 conversions on the ad set level per week. If it doesn't get 50 conversions, you'll have that learning limited, which, by the way, don't believe the hype. Don't worry about that. My personal recommendation that I use and I've seen work really well is make sure that you're spending enough on the ad set level to get at least 20 conversions. If you have a brand that is really, scared about creative testing, they're like, oh, we only want to spend $10 a day on creative testing. If you let's go back to the example where the CPA is $70. If you're only allowing that ad to spend $10 a day, if the CPA is $70, at 7 days, you maybe get enough to clock one sale on your campaign, creative. There's no way that that's going to be able to optimize. Meta is not getting enough data points for that creative to even have a chance at being successful. You might as well have just thrown that $70 down the drain. So I would say within reason, again, it depends on what your average CPA is, but try really hard if you can to get the ad set level spend enough to have 20 conversions a week. Otherwise, the ad set's not going to be able to optimize at all, and you might as well have not bothered running the creative tests there.
So important. And we'll be going into that a little bit more on our next episode where we focus on...
I'm jumping the gun.
No worries at all. It's a good segue into it. We'll be going into that as we're looking at optimizing, looking at understanding what metrics we're looking at for performance, the naming conventions and how we go about using those within our agency, and then decision-making as well. So we've covered quite a bit in this episode. This is episode 5, I believe, or let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is episode 6. I hope I'm saying that right, of this. Next episode, we will be going over those topics there.